3 days ago, you crossed into a moment that many spiritual traditions would consider unusually powerful, the threshold known as the Lion's Gate. And if you have felt as though something inside you has not quite returned to normal since then, there is a reason this period may still feel unfinished. The energy surrounding that opening has not completely settled into the background, and before you have even had time to understand everything it stirred within you, another major celestial event is already approaching. Today is August 11th, 2026, and tomorrow brings a total solar eclipse in Leo, placing the same sign that has dominated this entire sequence at the center of another extraordinary turning point. Do not mistake this for simply one more transit arriving immediately after another. Eclipses have long been regarded by astrologers as periods when the pace of change can suddenly accelerate, as though developments that might normally unfold over months are compressed into a much shorter span of time. What makes this particular eclipse even more significant is that it is the very first eclipse occurring on a completely new nodal axis, an axis that only came into existence a few weeks ago. If you have been following this unfolding sequence since the first signs of the Lion's Gate appeared, then you already know that this portion of the calendar has carried an unusual density of symbolism and astrological movement. And tomorrow introduces another major layer to that story. That is why today deserves your attention. You still have this final window in which you can consciously acknowledge what has been moving through your life before tomorrow potentially increases the speed of those developments. Think back to the last several days and ask yourself what has felt different. Perhaps your emotions have been stronger than usual. Perhaps an old desire has returned to your awareness. Perhaps you have suddenly recognized that something you once tolerated no longer feels acceptable. Maybe the change has been almost invisible, nothing more than a thought you could not stop returning to, a conversation that affected you more deeply than expected, or a quiet sense that your priorities are rearranging themselves. If you have noticed anything shifting today, even something extremely subtle, share it in the comments, because these small observations can sometimes reveal how a larger personal process is beginning to unfold. And if you want to remain present through tomorrow and understand how this sequence develops, stay connected as we move through the eclipse together. There is a deeper reason these two major events, the Lion's Gate and the eclipse arriving tomorrow, are occurring so close together this year. Their closeness should not be viewed merely as a random coincidence on the calendar. Both are strongly centered around Leo, the fixed fire sign associated with expression, identity, courage, creativity, and the willingness to occupy your own space without apology. Because they activate the same symbolic territory, their effects can build upon one another rather than pulling your attention toward completely separate areas of life. The Lion's Gate 3 days ago was often interpreted as a period of heightened openness, a time when inner clarity, conscious intention, and deliberate engagement with your personal direction could feel especially meaningful. Tomorrow, the eclipse continues the same broader atmosphere, but it does so in a very different way. The Lion's Gate can be approached through conscious participation, through reflection, intention, and a willingness to meet the moment. An eclipse carries a more unpredictable quality. Astrologers often associate eclipses with developments that continue moving whether or not you feel emotionally prepared for them. This distinction is important because something that began quietly around the Lion's Gate may now gain momentum. An intention you formed may become more difficult to ignore. A pattern you had only begun questioning may start showing its consequences more clearly. A part of your life that has been gradually loosening may move toward a point where remaining exactly as you were becomes increasingly difficult. This does not mean you need to panic or assume that something dramatic must happen tomorrow. It means that the internal movement already underway may become harder to overlook. That is why today can be valuable. Instead of waiting passively for tomorrow to tell you what everything means, you have an opportunity right now to become more conscious of what has already been changing. There is another reason tomorrow deserves careful attention. This total solar eclipse is the first eclipse occurring along the newly established Leo-Aquarius nodal axis. That axis began its 18-month cycle only weeks ago, when the lunar nodes moved into Leo and Aquarius. The importance of this timing goes beyond the single eclipse itself, because astrologers often view the first eclipse along a new nodal axis as the beginning of a larger story. Tomorrow is not necessarily an isolated event. It is the opening movement in a sequence of eclipses that will continue returning to this same axis throughout the coming year and a half. Themes that emerge now may therefore become subjects that develop, repeat, deepen, or transform through later eclipses connected to this axis. Something that appears small tomorrow may eventually prove to have been the beginning of a much longer process. Something that feels emotionally significant may become a reference point. You understand much more clearly months from now. The eclipse path itself will travel across the Arctic, Greenland, Iceland, and the Atlantic, with totality reaching portions of northern Spain. Compared with many recent eclipses, this creates a relatively unusual geographic pathway. The total eclipse will only be physically visible along that narrow corridor. But the symbolic and astrological meaning traditionally associated with an eclipse is not generally limited to the locations where totality can be seen. Wherever you are, tomorrow can still represent a meaningful marker within the larger astrological cycle, and today gives you an opportunity to approach it consciously, rather than simply waiting for the event to pass over you. Human beings have recognized eclipses as unusual celestial moments for thousands of years, and cultures across the world have developed very different explanations for what they witnessed. Ancient Chinese astronomers described an eclipse through the image of a celestial dragon consuming the sun, and communities responded by creating loud sounds and beating drums in an effort to drive the creature away and restore the daylight. Norse mythology offered another powerful image, describing wolves pursuing the sun. Various indigenous American traditions approached eclipses differently, often emphasizing quietness, stillness, and reflection instead of fear. These traditions were not identical, yet they shared something important. They recognized that an eclipse was not an ordinary sight in the sky, and that such a moment deserved collective awareness, ritual, attention, or reflection. The language we use today may be based on astronomical mechanics rather than mythology, but the human instinct to pause when the sun is temporarily obscured remains remarkably familiar. There is another important piece already active within this short window. Yesterday, Mars formed an exact trine with the North Node. This is a genuinely rare configuration, and astrologers often associate it with the opening of a powerful new chapter, especially for certain signs, although its influence extends across the entire zodiac. Mars represents movement, courage, initiative, assertion, and the instinct to act. The North Node represents a direction of collective growth and the path toward what is still developing. When these 2 points connect harmoniously, the symbolism favors action that is purposeful and aligned with a deeper direction rather than action driven by temporary frustration or impulse. Because this trine occurred only 1 day before the eclipse, it can be understood as preparing the energetic atmosphere for what comes next. It places an emphasis on movement, confidence, and deliberate choice at precisely the moment when the eclipse is beginning to build toward its more transformative influence. This is why today can feel like a meeting point between several different currents. The Lion's Gate energy from 3 days ago is still settling. Yesterday brought the decisive forward movement represented by the Mars North Node trine. Tomorrow introduces the total solar eclipse in Leo. 3 consecutive stages are therefore pressing into the same narrow period: reflection and heightened awareness, purposeful action, and accelerating transformation. It is difficult to find many ordinary days in a year where this much symbolic astrological activity is concentrated into such a short span. Yet there is an important lesson hidden inside that convergence. Spiritual thresholds rarely wait politely for one another. One energetic chapter does not always finish completely before another begins. Life can place you between several transitions at once, and part of spiritual maturity is learning how to remain grounded when multiple processes are unfolding simultaneously. You do not always receive the luxury of resolving one question before the next one appears. Sometimes you are asked to carry uncertainty while still making conscious choices. This week has provided exactly that kind of experience. Astrologers identify 6 signs as experiencing the Mars North Node trine with particular intensity. Aries. Cancer and Aquarius are described as entering what may feel like a genuinely new chapter, while Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio are associated with long-anticipated success finally beginning to arrive, although that success may appear through forms or circumstances that differ considerably from what was originally imagined. If you belong to one of these 6 signs, the energy of today may provide additional momentum as you approach tomorrow, creating a sense of confidence or inner support before the eclipse reveals what it has come to reveal. But if your sign is not included in that group, do not interpret that as exclusion. Major transits still move through every chart. Their expression simply depends upon the houses, placements, and individual patterns within your own birth chart. The experience can therefore look completely different from one person to another, while still belonging to the same larger celestial movement. And as tomorrow approaches, there is one final piece you need to understand. Eclipses do not always wait until the exact moment of totality before people begin noticing their psychological or emotional effects. Many people report sensing changes several days beforehand, and sometimes the sensations become more noticeable only hours before the peak. Today sits precisely 1 day before the total solar eclipse, placing you directly inside that period when anticipation, emotional sensitivity, unusual awareness, and internal movement may become easier to recognize. You may find yourself thinking about something you thought you had already resolved. You may feel an unfamiliar urgency without immediately knowing where it comes from. You may notice that an old desire suddenly feels alive again, or that a familiar situation no longer produces the same emotional response. These experiences do not necessarily mean that something external has already changed. Sometimes the first change happens inside your perception, and only later does the outer world begin reflecting what your inner world has already recognized. This is where tomorrow begins to differ from an ordinary planetary transit, and understanding that difference is the next key to understanding what you may be feeling right now. The most important thing to recognize right now is that an eclipse does not behave like an ordinary planetary transit, and understanding that difference may help you make sense of sensations that otherwise seem impossible to explain. In a typical transit, one planet moves through a sign, or creates an aspect with another point in the chart, and although the influence can be meaningful, it usually develops through a more gradual rhythm that gives you time to notice what is happening and adjust along the way. An eclipse creates a very different atmosphere because the Sun, Moon, and Earth temporarily align in a configuration that occurs far less frequently, and many astrological and spiritual traditions associate that alignment with an amplification of themes that are already active within a person's life. Instead of allowing a process to unfold slowly over many weeks or months, eclipse symbolism is often connected with a compression of development, as though something that has been quietly moving beneath the surface suddenly receives enough pressure to become visible much sooner than expected. That is why eclipse periods can feel strangely intense, urgent, and difficult to predict compared with the steadier movement of ordinary planetary cycles. You may not be able to point toward one obvious reason for what you are feeling, yet something inside you may seem unable to settle. The first sign often appears as a restless internal atmosphere that is difficult to explain. It is not necessarily ordinary anxiety, because there may be no single problem attached to it, no specific fear that you can identify and solve. Instead, it can resemble invisible static surrounding your awareness, a sense that something is gathering, even though nothing obvious has changed in your external circumstances. If today has been unusually difficult for you to relax, concentrate, sit still, or feel completely comfortable inside your own routine, do not automatically assume that you are simply having a bad day. You may be noticing the heightened atmosphere associated with this approaching eclipse. The second sign can appear through your dream life. Your dreams may become unusually vivid, emotionally charged, detailed, or memorable, perhaps even more intense than what you experienced around the Lion Gate only a few days ago. Rather than feeling like ordinary fragments of daily mental processing, these dreams can sometimes seem meaningful when you wake, carrying an emotional tone or clarity that remains with you long after the dream itself has ended. You might wake with the feeling that something was communicated without words, or that an image, person, place, or emotion represented something you have not yet consciously understood. The third sign is sudden clarity around an issue you have been postponing, avoiding, or repeatedly telling yourself that you will deal with later. This resembles the decision-making clarity associated with the period following the Lion Gate. But there can be a stronger sense of immediacy now. Instead of continuing to debate the same question internally, you may suddenly realize that waiting is no longer comfortable. The strange part is that the answer may not arrive through a long process of reasoning. It may simply appear, almost fully formed, and leave you wondering why you spent so much time struggling with something that suddenly seems obvious. This is one reason eclipse periods are often connected with accelerated timing. The hesitation that might normally fade gradually over several days or weeks can suddenly give way to certainty. You may recognize that a conversation needs to happen, that a choice needs to be made, that a pattern needs to be acknowledged, or that something you have been tolerating can no longer continue in exactly the same way. The fourth sign is emotional sensitivity that may feel much stronger than your usual reactions. Feelings can rise with very little warning, and the intensity may appear disproportionate to whatever triggered it. You might become unexpectedly tearful, irritated by something that would normally seem insignificant, or suddenly experience an emotional wave that seems much larger than the immediate situation deserves. This can be confusing because part of you may look at the circumstance and think, "This is not enough to make me feel this much." Yet the visible trigger may not be the true source of the emotion. Sometimes a small event simply becomes the opening through which older material finally rises. A minor disappointment can touch an old wound. A simple comment can awaken something you thought you had already moved beyond. A moment of frustration can expose exhaustion that has been accumulating quietly for much longer than you realized. During a period associated with heightened eclipse intensity, these buried emotional layers may become easier to access because the usual defenses are temporarily less effective. The fifth and final sign is one of the most unusual, because it can make you feel as though two different chapters of your life are occupying the same moment. You may sense that something is ending while something else is beginning, even though you cannot yet explain precisely what either process means. There can be a strange feeling of standing between identities, routines, expectations, or emotional patterns, with one familiar reality becoming less convincing, while another possibility has not yet fully appeared. This in-between state can feel unsettling because human beings naturally prefer certainty. We want to know what is ending before we release it, and we want to see what is beginning before we trust it. Eclipse periods can challenge that preference by placing you directly inside the transition. You may know that something has changed without knowing exactly what comes next. At the same time, beneath the uncertainty, there can be a quiet feeling of hope, as though some unseen possibility has already started forming beyond the edge of your present awareness. If you have recognized several of these 5 experiences within yourself today, take the recognition seriously, but do not turn it into fear. You do not need to assume that something dramatic or frightening must happen tomorrow. The purpose of noticing these signs is not to create anxiety about the eclipse. It is to help you become conscious of the movement already occurring within you, so that you are not completely surprised by changes that may already be developing. Awareness itself is a form of preparation. You do not need to force an outcome, perform something elaborate, or make a dramatic decision simply because the eclipse is approaching. Sometimes the most powerful preparation is simply observing what your body, emotions, thoughts, and instincts are already telling you without immediately judging them as good or bad. There is also an important difference between preparing for this eclipse and preparing for the Lion Gate. The earlier preparation centered more strongly around gentle release, conscious intention, and deliberately choosing what you wanted to welcome into your life. Eclipse preparation asks for something different. It places greater emphasis on grounding, stability, emotional readiness, and the ability to remain centered while circumstances accelerate around you. If you approach tomorrow expecting the same kind of experience you associated with the Lion Gate, you may miss this distinction. Eclipse energy is often described by astrologers as less concerned with whether you feel ready and more connected with developments that are already in motion. Preparation, therefore, does not mean attempting to control exactly what tomorrow will produce. Instead, it means strengthening your inner foundation so that whatever becomes clearer, faster, or more emotionally demanding can be met without completely destabilizing you. Think of it as preparing the ground rather than trying to dictate the weather. Grounding becomes especially valuable today because heightened emotional or energetic experiences can pull your attention away from your physical surroundings and into constant anticipation. Grounding practices are simple actions that reconnect your nervous system with your body and the immediate physical world. Spending time outside can help. Walking barefoot on grass, sitting directly on the earth, or maintaining direct physical contact with natural elements can provide a simple reminder that you are still here in your body in this moment, regardless of how much internal movement may be occurring. Even holding something solid, such as a stone, can serve as a physical point of attention when your thoughts feel scattered. Breathing provides another accessible way to create this stability. You do not need an elaborate technique. Simply making each exhale longer than the inhale can encourage the body toward a calmer state, which can be especially useful if you've already noticed the restless sensation described earlier. Spending even 5 minutes breathing slowly and deliberately, with particular attention to extending each exhale, can help shift the baseline state of your nervous system before tomorrow arrives. Rest also matters more than you may realize. If your body is genuinely asking you to slow down today or tonight, listen, instead of forcing yourself to remain productive simply because you think you should. A nervous system that is already exhausted has fewer resources available for navigating heightened emotional experiences with steadiness. The same principle applies to nourishment and hydration. During emotionally intense periods, people sometimes forget to eat regularly, lose their appetite, or become so absorbed in their thoughts that basic physical needs are pushed aside. That can make an already demanding period feel even more overwhelming. Give your body regular nourishing food and enough water today. Do not separate this basic care from your spiritual preparation. Your physical condition directly affects your capacity to process emotional intensity, remain present, and respond rather than react. The stronger your physical foundation is, the more room you have to move through whatever tomorrow brings without losing contact with yourself. And that inner stability becomes the foundation for the next stage of this eclipse story. Tomorrow may feel more demanding than an ordinary day, and the way you protect your energy today can make a meaningful difference in how consciously you move through it. Eclipses are often associated with increased emotional sensitivity, which makes this an important moment to look carefully at your boundaries before the eclipse arrives. Think about the commitments already waiting for you, the obligations you have accepted, and the people or situations that normally require a great deal of emotional effort from you. Something that feels manageable under ordinary circumstances may feel considerably heavier during a heightened period like this. If you have any freedom to adjust your schedule tomorrow, consider whether you truly need to fill every available space with responsibilities, demanding interactions, or difficult conversations. This does not mean abandoning everything, cancelling every appointment, or disappearing from the people around you. The point is much simpler and much more honest. Ask yourself what genuinely requires your presence tomorrow, and what could reasonably wait for another day or two until the intensity surrounding the eclipse has had time to settle. Sometimes protecting your energy is not avoidance. Sometimes it is recognizing that timing matters. There are moments when a conversation can be handled with patience and clarity, and there are other moments when the same conversation can feel overwhelming, simply because your emotional capacity is already stretched. Many spiritual traditions have also encouraged caution around major irreversible decisions during eclipse periods. This echoes the caution previously associated with the Lion Gate, but eclipses are often approached with even greater care because their symbolism is connected with acceleration and developments that may be difficult to reverse once they begin moving. If you find yourself standing before a major decision today or tomorrow, pause before assuming that immediate action is necessary. Ask whether the matter truly demands a response right now, or whether you can allow yourself a little more time and revisit it after the eclipse has passed and the atmosphere becomes more settled. Waiting does not always mean weakness or indecision. Sometimes waiting is the clearest way to make sure that a permanent decision is not being made from a temporary emotional state. Your boundaries also deserve attention in the digital world. During periods when emotions are already heightened, social media can become an amplifier. You may begin by checking one message or one account, then find yourself moving from one person's experience to another, comparing your feelings with what strangers claim to be feeling, anticipating what tomorrow might bring, and gradually absorbing anxiety that did not originally belong to you. If you have noticed yourself reaching for your phone more often today, especially when you feel uncertain or restless, consider creating a gentle limit around that habit. Tomorrow in particular, protecting some of your attention from the constant stream of other people's. Interpretations may allow you to experience your own reality more directly. You do not need to understand this eclipse through someone else's story. Your experience is yours to observe. Another practice that can become especially useful during a period like this is keeping a simple journal devoted specifically to the eclipse. This can remain completely separate from any regular journaling habit you already have. It does not need pages of analysis, complicated questions, or an elaborate ritual. A few honest sentences today, followed by another brief entry after the eclipse tomorrow, can become a surprisingly valuable record of what this period actually did within your life. Before the eclipse reaches its peak, write about what feels as though it is ending. It does not have to be something dramatic. Perhaps an attitude is fading. Perhaps an old expectation no longer carries the same emotional weight. Perhaps a relationship dynamic, habit, assumption, or version of yourself feels as though it is quietly losing its place in your life. You do not need to know exactly why it is ending, and you do not need to force yourself to define it perfectly. Simply name what you can honestly sense. Then, write about what seems to be beginning. Again, it may be extremely subtle. It may be nothing more than an unfamiliar desire, a new possibility, a different emotional response, or a feeling that something is slowly forming beyond what you can currently see. Eclipses are often associated with this strange coexistence of closure and emergence, and recording both sides before the peak gives you something concrete to return to later. In the days and weeks that follow, you can look back at what you wrote today and compare it with what actually unfolded. You may discover that your first instinct was remarkably accurate. You may also discover that what you thought was ending was actually changing form, or that what you believed was beginning took a completely different shape than expected. That comparison can teach you more about your own patterns than any general interpretation ever could, because it allows you to observe how astrological symbolism intersects with your actual circumstances rather than simply accepting someone else's prediction. Add one more element to that journal entry, a genuine expression of gratitude. Keep it specific. Think of one relationship, one opportunity, one quality within yourself, or one part of your current life that you sincerely appreciate, carrying forward with you into tomorrow. This is not an instruction to pretend everything is wonderful. It is not an invitation to cover pain with forced positivity. If this week has brought difficulty, confusion, or emotional discomfort, you can acknowledge those realities honestly. Gratitude simply prevents the reflection from becoming completely focused on what is disappearing. It reminds you that even when one part of life is changing, something valuable can remain. Many spiritual traditions consider that balance important when moving through major thresholds, because grounded transformation requires room for both honest recognition of difficulty and genuine appreciation for what remains meaningful. Now return to the 5 signs we explored earlier: restlessness, vivid dreams, sudden clarity, heightened emotion, and the strange awareness of an ending and beginning occurring together. Today gives you an opportunity to respond to each one consciously, instead of simply allowing these experiences to carry you wherever they happen to go. If restlessness has been increasing, let your body participate in releasing it. Take a walk, stretch gently, or engage in simple physical movement that gives the sensation somewhere to go. When restless energy remains trapped entirely inside the mind, it can turn into repetitive thinking and mental circling. Physical movement can give your attention another pathway. If your dreams have become unusually vivid, place a notebook close to your bed tonight so you can record what you remember immediately after waking. Dreams can disappear quickly once ordinary morning activity begins, and even a few words may later help you recognize an emotional theme that was difficult to understand in the moment. If sudden clarity has appeared around something you have been avoiding, you do not necessarily need to resolve the entire situation today. Instead, consider taking one small practical step. A message you need to draft, a piece of information you need to gather, a task you need to begin, or a decision you need to acknowledge can be enough. The purpose is not to force the final outcome. It is to respect the clarity that has arrived by giving it one concrete expression. If strong emotions have surfaced, make room for them rather than immediately trying to suppress them or convince yourself that you should not feel what you feel. Eclipse periods are often described as bringing buried material toward conscious awareness, and an emotion that appears suddenly may be carrying a history much larger than the event that triggered it. Let yourself notice the feeling before deciding what it means. And if you have experienced that unusual sensation that something is ending while something else is beginning, do not demand complete certainty from yourself. You may not yet have the language for what is changing. You may only know that an old internal arrangement no longer feels quite right, and that another possibility is quietly emerging. That in-between feeling can be one of the clearest indications that you are sensing the threshold before you have enough information to explain it. As today moves toward evening, there is value in looking briefly toward tomorrow, because everything you are doing today has a practical purpose. The eclipse itself does not necessarily require elaborate ritual or constant activity. Many traditions instead emphasize conscious presence, allowing the experience to unfold while remaining as aware and grounded as possible. Tomorrow may be a day to treat yourself with greater patience. If emotions rise quickly, you do not need to criticize yourself for having them. If you need quiet, give yourself permission to create some quiet. If you notice something demanding your attention, observe it before immediately deciding what action must follow. Eclipse symbolism is often associated with revelation, and revelations do not always arrive in the form you expected. Sometimes the important realization is a feeling. Sometimes it is a conversation. Sometimes it is simply the unmistakable recognition that you can no longer look at something in exactly the same way. Your preparation today is therefore not an attempt to control what tomorrow produces. It is an attempt to develop enough stability and awareness that you can meet whatever becomes visible without being completely carried away by it. As evening approaches, remember how unusual this exact sequence has been. The settling influence of the Lion's Gate from 3 days ago is still part of the background. Yesterday brought the Mars North Node trine and its associated forward momentum. Tomorrow brings the total solar eclipse in Leo, the first eclipse along the newly established 18-month nodal cycle. This particular combination will not repeat in precisely this configuration. That makes today more than simply another day before another transit. It is the final space in this sequence where you can consciously gather yourself, notice what has already shifted, establish the boundaries you may need, reconnect with your body, and honestly record what appears to be ending and beginning. You do not need to manufacture a profound experience. You do not need to force a prediction. You only need to remain present enough to notice what is actually happening. And when you step back and consider the larger picture, the remarkable nature of this period becomes even clearer. Within only 5 days, you have moved through the rare 8 Lion's Gate experience, the settling period that followed it, witnessed an uncommon Mars North Node trine creating fresh momentum for several signs, and now stand only hours away from the very first eclipse connected with an entirely new 18-month nodal cycle. Very few stretches within a full year contain this many overlapping layers of astrological significance within such a compressed period. Whatever you have experienced during these past several days, whether it has been dramatic or almost invisible, whether you have consciously recognized it or only sensed that something was different, you have been moving through an unusually concentrated period of astrological activity. The meaning of some of it may already be clear to you, while other pieces may only make sense after more time has passed. Either way, tomorrow marks the next major threshold, and everything you have noticed, questioned, released, protected, and written down today becomes part of the awareness you carry into that moment. Before tomorrow arrives, there is one principle that matters more than anything else you could possibly do. Your presence matters far more than your performance. You do not need to create an elaborate ceremony, follow a complicated ritual, or convince yourself that you must feel something extraordinary in order to honor this threshold in a meaningful way. What matters most is the quality of attention you bring to your own experience. Throughout today, pause from time to time and quietly check in with yourself. Notice what your body is feeling. Notice which thoughts keep returning. Notice which emotions are rising. And notice what you seem to be drawn toward or away from, without immediately deciding that every sensation needs an explanation or a solution. That simple willingness to observe can be far more useful during a threshold like this than forcing yourself into an elaborate spiritual performance. Tomorrow, if a powerful emotion moves through you, allow yourself to experience it instead of immediately pushing it down because you believe you should remain composed. An unexpected wave of sadness, anger, relief, tenderness, or uncertainty does not automatically need to become a problem that you must solve. Sometimes an emotion simply needs enough space to complete its movement through you. If an important realization appears, record it. Put the insight into words so that you do not lose it once the intensity of the moment begins to fade. But at the same time, remember the caution that served you around the Lion Gate, and apply it even more carefully now because eclipse symbolism is often associated with stronger acceleration and developments that can feel more difficult to reverse. A powerful feeling can be meaningful without being a command to act immediately. A sudden realization can deserve attention without requiring an irreversible decision that same moment. Give yourself permission to recognize what has become clear while still allowing time to reveal whether that clarity remains steady after the emotional intensity has passed. And if tomorrow turns out to be surprisingly quiet, if you wake up expecting some enormous internal shift and instead experience an ordinary morning, calm emotions, familiar routines, or simply a peaceful day, trust that experience too. There is nothing wrong with you if the eclipse does not arrive with dramatic sensations. Thresholds do not affect every person in identical ways. Some people experience them with striking intensity, while others notice changes gradually, sometimes only recognizing their significance weeks or even months afterward, when a pattern finally becomes visible. Your current circumstances, the placements within your individual chart, and your own temperament can all influence how noticeable an eclipse feels. Some people may move through tomorrow with very little disruption at all, and that does not mean they have somehow failed to recognize an important message or that they are missing something spiritually significant. You do not need to manufacture anxiety, emotion, synchronicity, or drama simply because you have been told that an eclipse can be intense. If your experience is calm, let it be calm. In fact, genuine steadiness during a period traditionally associated with heightened intensity can be understood as evidence of the inner stability that this entire week of preparation has been encouraging you to develop. The goal was never to become overwhelmed enough to prove that something powerful was happening. The goal was to become grounded enough to remain present regardless of what happens. At the same time, while we have spent so much time discussing tomorrow through symbolic and energetic language, it is important to return briefly to the physical reality beneath all of these interpretations. Tomorrow will involve a genuine total solar eclipse. The moon will move directly between the Earth and the Sun, completely blocking direct sunlight along a narrow path that crosses the Arctic, Greenland, Iceland, and reaches totality over portions of northern Spain and the Atlantic Ocean. This is not simply an abstract spiritual metaphor. It is a measurable astronomical event involving the actual movement and alignment of celestial bodies. The timing also adds another physical detail that makes this particular eclipse especially striking. It occurs slightly more than 2 days after the moon reaches its closest approach to Earth during this month, which means that the moon will appear especially large in the sky. For observers located within the narrow path of totality, that can make the visual experience of the eclipse particularly remarkable. The physical event itself is part of the reason total solar eclipses have fascinated human beings throughout recorded history. Across cultures and centuries, people have looked upward when daylight temporarily changes, and they have responded with reverence, curiosity, caution, mythology, ritual, and wonder. The interpretations have differed enormously, but the celestial phenomenon itself has remained real and observable. Whether or not you live inside tomorrow, narrow path of visibility, remembering this astronomical foundation can help keep the entire conversation grounded. The symbolic meanings associated with an eclipse exist alongside a genuine physical event that can be measured, observed, and understood through astronomy. There is also one practical matter that deserves complete seriousness if you happen to be somewhere within the path where the eclipse can be viewed directly. Never look directly at the sun during the eclipse without proper certified eclipse glasses, except during the brief period of complete totality when the sun is fully obscured. Ordinary sunglasses, even extremely dark ones, are not sufficient protection for viewing the sun. Looking directly at the partial phases without appropriate certified eyewear can cause serious and permanent damage to your eyes. If you intend to watch tomorrow eclipse directly, make certain that you have proper certified solar viewing glasses that meet the required safety standards before the event begins. Spiritual reflection should never come at the expense of basic physical safety, and there is another reason you should approach tomorrow with patience rather than expecting every question to receive an immediate answer. This eclipse is the first eclipse occurring along the newly established Leo-Aquarius nodal axis. That means tomorrow should be understood within the context of a much longer cycle, rather than treated as a complete story that must explain everything in a single day. The new Leo-Aquarius nodal axis began an 18-month cycle only weeks ago, and future eclipses will return repeatedly to this same axis during that period. What appears tomorrow may therefore be an opening theme rather than a final conclusion. A realization could become the first sentence of a much longer story. An emotional release could create space for developments that are not yet visible. A change that initially seems insignificant could become more meaningful when viewed several months from now. You do not need every piece to make sense by tomorrow evening. You do not need to know exactly where the entire 18-month cycle is leading. Think of tomorrow as the opening of a conversation rather than the delivery of a final answer. Something may be revealed, initiated, released, or awakened, but its full meaning can continue developing long after the eclipse itself has passed. If something significant emerges through an insight, an emotional release, or simply a deep internal recognition that your life is beginning to move in a different direction, allow yourself to receive that moment without demanding that it immediately explain the entire future. Let the meaning unfold at its own pace. As today gradually comes to an end, and tomorrow eclipse approaches within only a few hours, take a moment to look back at everything this remarkable stretch has already contained. You moved through the rare 8 Lionsgate threshold, then entered the quieter period that followed as its energy began settling. Yesterday brought the confident forward momentum associated with the Mars North trine, and tomorrow now stands before you as the opening chapter of an entirely new eclipse cycle that can continue influencing the collective and personal landscape throughout the next year and a half. Whatever these past several days have felt like for you, whether something dramatic happened externally, whether your internal world changed quietly, or whether you simply noticed subtle shifts that you cannot yet explain, remember that you have been paying attention. That sincerity is more valuable than trying to create one spectacular spiritual experience. You have not needed to prove anything. You have simply been asked to remain awake to your own experience. Tomorrow, as the eclipse travels across the sky, you will also become part of a much larger human continuity. You will be joining millions of people who have followed this Lionsgate sequence with you during the past week. But you will also be connected to something far older than this particular conversation, this particular year, or even any single spiritual tradition. For as long as human beings have recorded their experiences, people have looked toward the sky during total solar eclipses and tried to understand what they were witnessing. Every generation has created its own explanations, its own rituals, and its own language of reverence around essentially the same astronomical phenomenon. That continuity is worth considering today. It reminds you that your individual experience exists within a much larger human story, one that stretches across centuries and cultures and continues every time someone looks upward and realizes that the sky has changed. Whatever you experience tomorrow belongs to your own life, but it also connects you to something far larger than the immediate moment in which you are standing. And if these reflections have helped you feel more prepared, take a moment to share what you have actually noticed. Tell me which of the 5 signs has been most recognizable for you today. Whether it has been restlessness, vivid dreams, sudden clarity, heightened emotion, or that unmistakable feeling of an ending and a beginning happening together. You can also share what you are consciously choosing to set down before tomorrow eclipse arrives. Your reflections help create a space where thousands of people can recognize that they are moving through significant moments alongside others. Even when those people are living in completely different places and experiencing the same celestial event through completely different personal circumstances. If this reflection has resonated with you, stay connected for the eclipse coverage tomorrow and share this message with someone who may benefit from approaching the threshold with greater calm and awareness. Most importantly, remember what this entire journey has been teaching you. Whatever this remarkable week has already brought into your awareness, and whatever tomorrow still has waiting beyond the horizon, you have the ability to meet it with intention rather than fear. You do not need to control every outcome. You do not need to understand every sign immediately. You do not need to force a dramatic transformation simply because the calendar contains a powerful celestial event. Your willingness to remain conscious, grounded, honest, and attentive is enough. That intention, more than any single emotional experience, prediction, ritual, or dramatic outcome, is what can carry you forward into whatever comes next. Thank you for walking through this unusual week with me, from the Lion's Gate, through its quiet aftermath, through the momentum of the Mars North Node trine, and now into the final hours before tomorrow eclipse. Whatever tomorrow brings, meet it with the same grounded presence that has carried you through everything this week has already asked you to notice.